Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring time warps. Volume 1. The Beast of Boredom by Richard Rein Smith. As Long as You Wish by John O'Keefe. Hall of Mirrors by Fredric Brown. Delayed Action by Charles V. DeVet. Transfer Point by Anthony Boucher. The Beast of Boredom by Richard Rein Smith. Originally published in Infinity, April 1958. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The shack at the edge of the dead canal was so carefully camouflaged he almost passed by it. Hoping he hadn't been seen, he dropped to his stomach and crawled through the mud toward the door. It wasn't a long distance, but inching his way on his elbows and knees, and with his face close to the evil-smelling mud, it seemed like a mile. As he crawled, he reflected bitterly that most of mankind's really great achievements always ended in war. Columbus had crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and it had ended in war with the Indians. Mankind had invented atomic energy and then used it to kill millions. Their latest achievement was a marvel of space flight, and where had that ended? It also ended in war. Personally, he didn't believe they were justified in fighting the Martians. If they didn't want anyone intruding on the planet, what right did Earthmen have to force their way? The popular theory that they could help rebuild the dying Martian civilization didn't seem very logical when millions had to be killed in the process. And if Martians were an independent race and wanted to sit around and watch their civilization crumble, why shouldn't they have that privilege? When he was within a few yards of the door, he set aside his philosophical thoughts. Leaping to his feet, he ran into the small shack and screamed shrilly in the manner designed to momentarily paralyze an enemy with fear. He raised the rifle instinctively when something moved in the shadows, and as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he felt a queasiness in his stomach. The emaciated alien who cowered in the shadows resembled a pitiful bundle of rags more than an enemy. Trembling hands lifted an object, and 3 things happened so rapidly that they seemed to happen simultaneously. The Martian's bony fingers moved over the object. A burning sensation ripped through his brain. He realized it must be a weapon and squeezed the trigger of his rifle. When the sharp crack stopped echoing in his ears, he examined the still form and discovered he had been mistaken. The object wasn't a weapon. It was a metal globe 6 inches in diameter and studded with precious jewels. The Martian had offered it in exchange for his life. The windows of his apartment on the 14th floor were open, and a gentle breeze chilled the sweat on his face as he worked with a knife. He had previously removed 4 jewels from the metal globe, but the large ruby he'd selected this time seemed to be embedded deeper. The blade slipped and slashed the palm of his left hand. Cursing the artifact and all Martians in general, he attacked the ruby furiously and grunted with satisfaction when he dislodged it. The red jewel rolled across the table and fell to the floor. Picking it up gingerly, as if it were a fragile thing of glass, he held it in the sunlight and watched the myriad facets sparkle like a one-color kaleidoscope. It was the largest jewel of all, and worth a small fortune. A sharp pain in his hand reminded him of his wound, and he went to the bathroom. After carefully washing the cut, he applied iodine and was trying to find a bandage when the ruby rolled across the table and fell to the floor. Startled, he leapt back and upset the chair. A second before he'd been in the bathroom, and now he was at the table. Amnesia? He couldn't remember walking back to the living room, and although he thought he'd put iodine on the cut, there was none on it that he could see. He went to the bathroom. The ruby rolled across the table and fell to the floor. He was sitting before the table again, without any memory of having left the bathroom. It had happened twice. Taking the globe to the window, he examined it carefully, and saw that where the ruby had been lodged, there was now an opening through the metal. When he held it at a certain angle, he saw a maze of wiring and tiny mechanisms inside. He had fought the Martians for 2 years. He had travelled across their red deserts, crawled on the muddy bottoms of their gigantic dead canals, walked through the remains of their ancient cities, and heard legends about the great Martian empire that had slowly crumbled during the centuries. He remembered the legends about Martian time machines, and he accepted the fact readily. The object in his hand was a time trap, an ancient, intricate, scientific booby trap. The Martian had known he would die, and had deliberately planned his revenge. Perhaps the machine wasn't strong enough to take anyone far into the past or future. That would explain why he hadn't used it to escape. But it was evidently strong enough to be used as a trap, and perhaps it had even been designed for that purpose centuries ago. Removing the ruby had triggered it. Ironic, he reflected, that he'd gone to so much trouble and expense to smuggle the thing from Mars to Earth. The jewels were worth a fortune, and it had never occurred to him that the metal globe might have some function. Actually, he had smuggled an ingenious death trap back to Earth with him. He shuddered at the thought. The ruby rolled across the table, and he was once again sitting before the Martian artifact, his eyes once again focused on the ruby as it rolled across the table. Like something in a magician's act, he had disappeared from his position near the window and reappeared in the chair. As before, the cut on his hand stung painfully, but this time he ignored it and kept his eyes focused on his wristwatch. It was 11:45 Eastern Standard Time. The ruby rolled across the table. His eyes were no longer focused on the watch, but he remembered that the hands had last indicated 11:55, and now they were back at 11:45. He was trapped in a period of time only 10 minutes long. He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers and tried to think calmly. What danger was there in a time trap? He felt no physical pain, and so far the trap had only caused him small inconveniences. Anything he did during the 10-minute period was magically undone when he was thrown backward in time. He had put iodine on the cut on his hand, and it had disappeared. He had walked to the window, but at the beginning of the next cycle, without any conscious sensation, he found himself sitting in the chair once more. But how could movement through time harm him? And was he the only one aware of the trap? He turned the television set on and watched a news announcer during several following cycles. Before long, he was convinced that he was the only one who was aware of the repeated time interval. The news announcer represented everyone in the world, and if he were conscious of the fact that he had read the same news more than a dozen times, there would have been some change in his expression. He recalled how the Martian had moved his fingers over the globe, and how he'd felt a burning sensation inside his skull. The device had evidently been adjusted to his neural pattern so that only he was conscious of the trap, or else only someone within a certain effective radius, 50 feet for instance, was conscious of the repeated time intervals. Although he had always believed the stories about the time machines, and he now had proof of their existence, he still found it difficult to comprehend their operation. He had heard that such a machine concentrated on only a few atoms of a radioactive substance. By drawing energy from the space-time continuum itself, the machine succeeded in thrusting those atoms backward or forward in time, and since that affected the entire probability stream, all physical matter was forced to follow them through the time stream. He couldn't totally comprehend the concept, but he realized he had to do something nevertheless, and during following cycles that totaled hours, he tried to decide on a course of action. He recalled the Martian legend of how a particularly vicious criminal had been punished with a similar machine. The unfortunate had been tossed into a pit filled with lion-like animals, and then, by repeating the time interval, he had been made to suffer the same death 1,000 times. In his own case, he was in no physical danger, but he knew that an enemy was creeping toward him, an enemy that could kill him as surely as any lion. Boredom. If he submitted to boredom and just sat through the endless time cycles, it would be the same as sitting in a room for weeks, months, or years. That would be the same as solitary confinement and would eventually drive him insane. So, there were two possibilities. He could attempt to wreck the machine, or wait for it to wear itself out and fight boredom while waiting. It didn't take him long to decide that he should wait for the machine to run down. If the alien devices really drew energy from the space-time continuum, it would be dangerous to tamper with one. A wrong move when fooling with such a tremendous amount of energy might be disastrous, and perhaps that was exactly what the old Martian had planned for him to do. On the other hand, it didn't seem possible that a machine could run forever. There should be plenty of ways to keep himself occupied and his mind busy while he waited. He began reading the magazines scattered about the apartment. There was only time to read a few pages, but he mentally noted the page number during each cycle, and when the succeeding interval began, he opened the magazine to that exact page and continued. The ruby rolled across the table, and the preceding cycles seemed like an eternity when he looked back upon them. He had read every magazine from cover to cover, watched every television program, and listened to every radio program countless times until he had them memorized word for word. He had worked the crossword puzzles in the newspaper several times and explored every square inch of the apartment. He had no more ideas, so he tried to sleep. He knew it was useless. During each 10-minute interval, he had time to walk from the chair to the davenport, close his eyes, and relax his body. But then, at the moment when he was about to fall asleep, he would always find himself in the tediously familiar chair. He hoped he would grow tired and be able to fall asleep, but finally realized it was impossible. Since the machine influenced the space-time continuum, and the same 10-minute interval in time was always repeated, all physical things in space were exactly as they had been at the beginning of the cycle. His body had been refreshed at the beginning of the original cycle, and it would always be in the same condition. He would never grow older, he would never become hungry, and he would never become tired, physically. Desperate for a way to overcome boredom, he used the bottle of whiskey in the kitchen. After several attempts, he discovered to his dismay that there were ways to get violently sick from gulping liquor, but no possible way to get drunk in 10 minutes. He sat through endless cycles staring at the empty air, began to have wild thoughts, and knew he was on the verge of insanity. And if he were losing the fight with boredom, he might as well try the other alternative, break the machine, and hope it wouldn't blow up in his face. Taking a long-bladed knife, he attacked the small mechanisms inside the globe. He probed, twisted, and jabbed, but they seemed indestructible. Furious, he held it under water with a hope that water would short-circuit electrical contacts if there were any. When that didn't work, he beat it with a hammer, kicked it, threw it about the room, and as a last resort, dropped it from the window. It bounced off the sidewalk 14 floors below and attracted attention, but a few minutes later he was once more sitting in the chair and watching the sickeningly familiar ruby as it rolled across the sickeningly familiar table. He stared at the telephone. If only it would ring. If only someone would call him and break the monotony. But that was impossible. At the beginning of each cycle, all physical things and events were exactly as they had been. Telephone! He could use it to break the monotony. He could phone all his friends. He telephoned all his friends and talked with them for numerous 10-minute intervals that totaled days. Because they were always unaware of the previous cycles, his repeated phone calls never annoyed them. Sometimes he told them about the time trap, but it was beyond their comprehension, and they always thought he was drunk, so he learned not to mention it. When he tired of talking to his friends, he started at the front of the telephone directory and began calling every name. He made dates with girls he'd never seen, memorized marvelous sales talks, and sold non-existent vacuum cleaners and cars. Sometimes he pretended to be the master of ceremonies on a quiz program, and when someone answered a difficult question, he told them they had just won $1. The various reactions he received were amusing and broke the monotony, but after a few days, even that became boring. He tried to leave the hotel's 14th floor, but discovered that the elevator boy was not on the job at that particular time. Although he ran to the elevator at the beginning of numerous cycles and pushed the down button, the indicator needle never moved during the 10 minutes. He used the stairs at the end of the corridor with the hope of reaching another floor and meeting someone. To see someone or speak to someone in person would have done a lot to break the monotony. But he found that the 13th and 15th floors were inaccessible. The doors that led to them from the stairway wouldn't push in, and there was no hand grip to pull them outward. Evidently, the hotel management used the method to prevent burglars from having an absurdly easy and unseen access to the apartments. Anyone could leave a floor and use the stairs to reach the hotel lobby, but anyone wishing to go from the lobby to a certain floor or from one floor to another was forced to use the elevator. Cursing the bad luck, he sat for hours and wondered what he could do. He was restricted to succeeding, but separate and identical time intervals, and that was also a physical restriction in effect. 10 minutes wasn't long enough to leave the floor of the hotel. He now thought of boredom as an ugly monster that lurked everywhere about him and waited to seize him with sharp teeth of inactivity. Desperate for the sight of another person, he tried to enter the other apartments. There were 5 on that floor, but of them only the one next to his own seemed to be occupied. When he knocked, there was no answer, but he pressed an ear against the door and heard the faint sound of running water. Whoever the occupant was, he or she was taking a shower and couldn't hear him no matter how hard he knocked. It irritated him because the apartment was so close. If he could contact the person somehow, he or she could be reached at the beginning of each cycle and would be a tangible individual to help him fight boredom. Not a voice on the telephone, an image on the TV screen, or a tiny dot of a person 14 floor below his window. By phoning the hotel desk, he learned that a woman named Mary Jeffers rented apartment 1403, and he found her telephone number in the directory. Dialing the number, he was relieved when she answered within a few minutes. The ringing of the phone was evidently loud enough to penetrate the noise of the shower, while his knocking on the door hadn't been. "Mary Jeffers," he answered. "Yes?" "Mary, are you a college graduate?" "Yes, who is this? Why do you want to know?" "This is the police. It's very important. Which college did you attend?" He knew it was a flimsy trick to get information, but he caught her off guard, and she answered, "The University of Delaware." He hung up the phone and waited until the next cycle. Dialing the number again, he said, "Mary, this is Harry Ogden." Because of the nature of the time trap, she was unaware of the previous conversation, and her automatic reply to the unfamiliar voice was, "Ogden, you must have the wrong number. I don't know anyone by that name." "Don't you remember? I went to the University of Delaware with you. I remember you. You have blonde hair and—" "No, it's brunette." Hanging up the phone, he waited until the next cycle, dialed the number again, and said, "Mary, this is Harry Ogden." "Ogden? You must have the wrong number. I don't know anyone by that name." "Don't you remember? I went to the University of Delaware with you. I remember you. You were a brunette about 130 pounds and—" "Well, not quite that much." By calling dozens of times, he used the system to learn more and more about Mary Jeffers, until at last he knew enough to convince her within a few minutes that he was a friend from her college days whom she had forgotten. As he talked with her during various cycles that totaled weeks, he began to feel as if she were a friend, and the desire to see her in person increased. The sight of anyone would have done wonders to break the monotony, and she was the only possibility since all the other apartments were empty. "I have the apartment next to yours," he said during one-time cycle. "Can I come over?" "I'm not dressed," she replied. "I was taking a shower. Give me time to get dressed." He glanced at his watch and saw that only 4 minutes remained in that cycle. He realized despairingly that there wasn't time for her to get dressed. All his efforts had been in vain. 10 minutes wasn't long enough to phone her, go through the carefully memorized routine convincing her she was an old friend, wait for her to dress, and open the door of the apartment. It couldn't be done in 10 minutes. Boredom was like a hungry beast that breathed in his ears with a roar of silence while he sat through several succeeding cycles. Silence. It seemed to echo in his ears as he looked about the apartment. It seemed to whisper that he was losing the jewel. The Martian's trap was working. He would sit and wait and think endlessly until there were wild thoughts, and he was insane. And then the Martian would have his revenge, for insanity was a form of walking death. He made a decision. He had fought boredom legally and exhausted every method he could think of. If there were no more legal ways, then he would fight boredom illegally. The police couldn't reach him in 10 minutes no matter what he did. Dialing Mary Jeffers' phone number at the beginning of the next cycle, he laid the receiver on the desk, ran across the room, and climbed through the window. The stone ledge just beneath his window wasn't very wide, but by inching his way along it, he reached the open window of apartment 1403. Climbing through the window, he saw that Mary Jeffers had picked up the telephone receiver with one hand and was trying to dry herself with a towel in the other. "Hello," she said. Her back was to him, but he noticed that she wasn't very efficient with the towel. Water dripped from her body and collected in a small pool around her feet. He grinned and said, "Hello." She whirled to face him and dropped the telephone receiver, her dark brown eyes widening. "Harry Ogden," he said. "Remember?" As soon as he asked the question, he knew it was a foolish one. The time trap was his trap alone, and only he was conscious of all the repeated cycles. She was unaware of all their previous conversations, and he was now a stranger to her. She backed away and let out a scream. It didn't bother him. It was music to his ears, a sound that broke the silence of his peculiar world, a weapon to combat boredom with, and he reflected that he would make many trips to apartment 1403. The ruby rolled across the table and fell to the floor. He smiled as he picked the ruby up from the floor. He estimated that he'd lived more than 20 years in 10-minute intervals, and therefore the trap was not a death trap. He discovered countless ways of fighting boredom, and knew he would never succumb to it and resultant insanity. He had entered the other apartments by using the stone ledge and breaking through the windows. In them he had found a total of hundreds of books, a pair of binoculars that he used to study a multitude of new things from his window, a typewriter that he used to write books although there were never a completed manuscript, a chess set, a deck of cards, hobbies. There were many more possibilities that he hadn't explored yet, and he realized that the Martian had given him a valuable gift: extra years of life. It seemed incredible that a machine could operate continuously for 20 years, but the ancient Martians had been expert in constructing devices without moving parts. He knew little science, but he could vaguely imagine a sort of gateway to the space-time continuum that the removal of the ruby had opened. Perhaps during a 10-minute period a predetermined amount of energy passed through the gateway and flowed against a radioactive substance in a way and with a force that thrust a few atoms backward in time to the point when the energy didn't exist, and that established the cycle. With moving parts, the machine wouldn't have run continuously for 20 years. Something would have broken down. Even without moving parts, the machine wouldn't run forever. The materials themselves would deteriorate sooner or later, or the energy passing through them from the space-time continuum would gradually disintegrate them no matter how strong they were. But for as long as the device operated, he would live without growing old. If it ran 100 years, he would live 100 years. The ruby rolled across the table and fell to the floor. He rubbed his aching head. He had lived approximately 30 years at 10-minute intervals, but the headache had started and grown in intensity during the last year, and it was difficult to recall and appreciate all the things he had done. The ruby rolled. How many years had he lived? 50? 100? He was unable to calculate it any more, and it was even difficult to think about much simpler things. His mind was filled with memories, millions, billions, trillions of endless, countless memories without any sleep to relax his mind, with no rest at all. The ruby. He no longer moved about the apartment, but sat in the chair during every cycle and watched the ruby as it rolled endlessly. Memories were like a crushing, paralyzing weight in his mind, a weight that grew and grew and... The old Martian he had killed would have his revenge. He realized the ingenious machine was much more than a gift or a death trap. It was a torture machine. A torture machine that would operate for centuries. A machine that would gradually crush his mind and kill him with the sheer weight of memories. He screamed. The end. Subscribe for more at storiesoffuturespast.substack.com. And now for the next story. As Long as You Wish by John O'Keefe. Originally published in Astounding Science Fiction, June 1955. Narrated by Tom Trussel. If, somehow, you get trapped in a circular time system, how long is the circumference of an infinitely retraced circle? The patient sat stiffly in the leather chair on the other side of the desk. Nervously he pressed a coin into the palm of one hand. "Just start anywhere," I said, "and tell me all about it." As before, without waiting for an answer, he continued, the coin clutched tightly in one hand. "I'm Charles J. Fisher, Professor of Philosophy at Riza College." He looked at me quickly, or at least I was until recently. For a second his face was boyish. Professor of Philosophy, that is. I smiled and found that I was staring at the coin in his hand. He gave it to me. On one side I read the words, "The statement on the other side of this coin is false." The patient watched me with an expressionless face. I turned over the coin, It was engraved with the words, "The statement on the other side of this coin is false." "That's not the problem," he said. "Not my problem. I had the coin made when I was an undergraduate. I enjoyed reading one side, turning it over, reading the other side, and so on. A fiendish enjoyment, like boys planning where to put the tipped-over outhouse." I looked at the patient. He was 38, single, medium build, had an MA and a PhD from an Eastern university. I knew this and more from the folder on my desk. "8 months ago," he continued, "I read about the sphere found on Penny Island." He stopped, looking at me questioningly. "Yes, I know," I said. I opened my desk drawer, took out a clipping from the newspaper, and handed it to him. "That's it." I read the clipping before putting it back in the drawer. "Manila, September 24. Archaeologists from University of California have discovered in Earth fault of recent quake a sphere 2 feet in diameter of an unidentifiable material. Dr. Karl Schwartz, head of the group, said the sphere was returned to the university for study. He declined to answer questions on the cultural origin of the sphere." "There wasn't any more in the newspapers about it," he said. "I have a friend in California who got me the photographs." He looked at me intently. "You won't believe any of this." He pressed the coin into the palm of his hand. "You won't be able to." "The photographs," he continued, as if lecturing, "were of characters projected by the sphere when placed before a focused light. The sphere was transparent, you see, embedded with dark microscopic specks. By moving the sphere a certain distance each time, there was a total projection of 360 different characters in 18 different orderings, or 19 different orderings if you count one which was a list of all the characters." I made a mental note of the numbers. I felt they were significant. "As I said," he continued, "I obtained the photographs of the characters. Very strange shapes, totally unlike the characters of Oriental languages, but yet that is the closest way to describe them." He jerked forward in his chair. "Except, of course, ostensively." "Later," I said. I wanted to get through the preliminaries first. There would be time later to see the photographs. "The characters projected by the sphere," he said, "weren't like the characters of any known language." He paused dramatically. "There was reason to believe they had origin in an unknown culture, a culture more scientifically advanced than our own." "And the reasons for this supposition?" I asked. The material of the sphere. It could only be roughly classified as ferroplastic. Totally unknown, amazing imperviousness. A synthetic material, hardly the product of a former culture. "From Mars?" I said, smiling. "There are all kinds of conjectures, but of course the important thing was to see if the projection of characters was a message. The message, if any, would mean more than any conjecture." "You translated it?" He polished the coin on his jacket. "You won't dare believe it," he said sharply. He cleared his throat and stiffened into a more rigid posture. "It wasn't exactly translation. You see, to us, none of the characters had designation. They were just characters." "So it was a problem of decoding?" I asked. "As it turned out, no. Decoding is dependent on knowledge of language characteristics of known languages. Decoding was tried, but without success. No, what we had to find was a key to the language." "You mean like the runestone?" "More or less. In principle, we needed a picture of a cow and a sign of meaning indicating one of the characters. For me, there was no possibility of finding similarities between the characters and characters of other languages. That would require tremendous linguistic knowledge and library facilities. nor could I use a decoding approach. That would require special knowledge of techniques and access to electronic computers and other mechanical aids. No, I had to work on the assumption that the key to the sphere was implicit in the sphere. You hoped to find the key to the language in the language itself? Exactly. You know, of course, some languages do have an implicit key. For example, hieroglyphics, or picture language. The word for cow is a picture of a cow. He looked at the toes of his shoes. You won't be able to believe it. It's impossible to believe. I use the word impossible in its logical sense. In most languages, he continued, looking up from his shoes, the sound of some words themselves indicates the meaning of the word. Onomatopoetic words like bow wow, buzz. And the key to the unknown language? I asked. How did you find it? I watched him push the coin against the back of his arm, then lift it to read the backward letters pressed into his skin. He looked up at me and smiled. I built models of the characters, big material ones, exactly proportionate to the ones projected. Then, quite by accident, I viewed one of them through a glass globe the size of the original sphere. What do you think I saw? What? I noticed he had the boyish look again. A distortion of the model. But that's not what's important. The distortions, on study, gave specific visual entities, like when looking at one of those trick pictures and suddenly seeing the lion in the grass. The lines outlining the lion are there all the time, only the observer has to view them as the outline of a lion. It was the same with the models of the characters, except the shapes that appeared were not of lions or other recognizable things, but they did suggest. He pressed the coin against his forehead, closed his eyes, and appeared to be thinking deeply. Yes, impossible to believe. No one can believe it. In addition to the visual response, the distortions gave me definite feelings, not mixtures of feelings, but one definite emotional experience. How do you mean? One character, when viewed through the globe, gave me a visual image and, at the same time, a strong feeling of light hilarity. I take it, then, that these distortions seem to connote meanings rather than denote them. You might say that their meaning was conveyed through a gestalt experience on the part of the observer. Yes, each character gave a definite gestalt, but the gestalt was the same for each observer, or at least for 35 observers there was an 80% correlation. I whistled softly. And the translation? Doctor, what would you say if I told you the translation was unbelievable, that it couldn't be seriously entertained by any man? What if I said that it would take the sanity of any man who believed it? I would say that it might well be incorrect. He took some papers from his pocket and laughed excitedly, slumping down in the chair. This is the complete translation in idiomatic English. I'm going to let you read it, but first I want you to consider a few things. He hid the papers behind the back of his chair. His face became even more boyish, almost as if he were deciding on where to put the tipped-over outhouse. Consider first, Doctor, that there was a total projection of 360 different characters, the same number as a number of degrees in a circle. Consider also that there were 18 different orderings of the characters, or 19 counting the alphabetical list. The square root of 360 would lie between 18 and 19. Yes, I said. I remembered there was something significant about the numbers, but I wasn't at all sure that it was this. Consider also, he continued, that the communication was through the medium of a sphere. Moreover, keep in mind that physics accepts the path of a beam of light as its definition of a straight line. Yet, the path is a curve. If extended sufficiently, it would be a circle, the section of a sphere. All right, I said, By now the patient was pounding the coin against the sole of one shoe. "And," he said, "keep in mind that in some sense time can be thought of as another dimension." He suddenly thrust the papers at me and sat back in the chair. I picked up the translation and began reading. The patient sat stiffly in the leather chair on the other side of the desk. Nervously, he pressed the coin into the palm of one hand. "Just start anywhere," I said, "and tell me all about it." As before, without waiting for an answer, he continued, the coin clutched tightly in one hand. "I'm Charles J. Fisher, Professor of Philosophy at Riza College." He looked at me quickly, or at least I was until recently. For a second his face was boyish. Professor of Philosophy, that is. I smiled and found that I was staring at the coin in his hand. He gave it to me. On one side I read the words, "The statement on the other side of this coin is false." The patient watched. The end. Subscribe for more at storiesoffuturespast.substack.com. And now for the next story. Hall of Mirrors by Fredric Brown. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, December 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. For an instant, you think it is temporary blindness, this sudden dark that comes in the middle of a bright afternoon. It must be blindness, you think. Could the sun that was tanning you have gone out instantaneously, leaving you in utter blackness? Then the nerves of your body tell you that you are standing, whereas only a second ago you were sitting comfortably, almost reclining, in a canvas chair, in the patio of a friend's house in Beverly Hills, talking to Barbara, your fiancée. Looking at Barbara in a swimsuit, her skin golden tan in the brilliant sunshine, beautiful. You wore swimming trunks. Now you don't feel them on you. The slight pressure of the elastic waistband is no longer there against your waist. You touch your hands to your hips. You are naked and standing. Whatever has happened to you is more than a change to sudden darkness or to sudden blindness. You raise your hands gropingly before you. They touch a plain, smooth surface, a wall. You spread them apart, and each hand reaches a corner. You pivot slowly. A second wall, then a third, then a door. You're in a closet, about 4 feet square. Your hands find the knob of the door. It turns, and you push the door open. There is light now. The door has opened to a lighted room, a room that you have never seen before. It is not large, but it is pleasantly furnished, although the furniture is of a style that is strange to you. Modesty makes you open the door cautiously the rest of the way, but the room is empty of people. You step into the room, turning to look behind you into the closet, which is now illuminated by light from the room. The closet is and is not a closet. It is the size and shape of one, but it contains nothing. Not a single hook, no rod for hanging clothes, no shelf. It is an empty, blank-walled 4x4-foot space. You close the door to it and stand looking around the room. It is about 12 by 16 feet. There is one door, but it is closed. There are no windows. 5 pieces of furniture. 4 of them you recognize, more or less. One looks like a very functional desk. One is obviously a chair, a comfortable-looking one. There is a table, although its top is on several levels instead of only one. Another is a bed, or couch. Something shimmering is lying across it, and you walk over and pick the shimmering something up and examine it. It is a garment. You are naked, so you put it on. Slippers are part way under the bed, or couch, and you slide your feet into them. They fit, and they feel warm and comfortable as nothing you have ever worn on your feet has felt. Like lamb's wool, but softer. You are dressed now. You look at the door, the only door of the room except that of the closet. Closet? From which you entered it. You walk to the door, and before you try the knob, you see the small typewritten sign pasted just above it that reads, "This door has a time lock set to open in 1 hour. For reasons you will soon understand, it is better that you do not leave this room before then. There is a letter for you on the desk. Please read it." It is not signed. You look at the desk and see that there is an envelope lying on it. You do not yet go to take that envelope from the desk and read the letter that must be in it. Why not? Because you are frightened. You see other things about the room. The lighting has no source that you can discover. It comes from nowhere. It is not indirect lightning. The ceiling and the walls are not reflecting it at all. They didn't have lighting like that back where you came from. What did you mean by back where you came from? You close your eyes. You tell yourself, "I am Norman Hastings. I am an associate professor of mathematics at the University of Southern California. I am 25 years old, and this is the year 1954. You open your eyes and look again. They didn't use that style of furniture in Los Angeles, or anywhere else that you know of, in 1954. That thing over in the corner, you can't even guess what it is. So might your grandfather, at your age, have looked at a television set. You look down at yourself, at the shimmering garment that you found waiting for you. With thumb and forefinger you feel its texture. It's like nothing you've ever touched before. I am Norman Hastings. This is 1954. Suddenly you must know, and at once. You go to the desk and pick up the envelope that lies upon it. Your name is typed on the outside, Norman Hastings. Your hands shake a little as you open it. Do you blame them? There are several pages typewritten. "Dear Norman," it starts. You turn quickly to the end to look for the signature. It is unsigned. You turn back and start reading. "Do not be afraid. There is nothing to fear, but much to explain. Much that you must understand before the time lock opens that door. Much that you must accept and obey. You have already guessed that you are in the future, in what to you seems to be the future. The clothes and the room must have told you that. I planned it that way so the shock would not be too sudden, so you would realize it over the course of several minutes rather than read it here, and quite probably disbelieve what you read. The closet from which you have just stepped is, as you have by now realized, a time machine. From it you stepped into the world of 2004. The date is April 7th, just 50 years from the time you last remember. You cannot return. I did this to you, and you may hate me for it. I do not know. That is up to you to decide. But it does not matter. What does matter, and not to you alone, is another decision which you must make. I am incapable of making it. Who is writing this to you? I would rather not tell you just yet. By the time you have finished reading this, even though it is not signed, for I knew you would look first for a signature, I will not need to tell you who I am. You will know. I am 75 years of age. I have, in this year 2004, been studying time for 30 of those years. I have completed the first time machine ever built, and thus far its construction, even the fact that it has been constructed, is my own secret. You have just participated in the first major experiment. It will be your responsibility to decide whether there shall ever be any more experiments with it, whether it should be given to the world, or whether it should be destroyed and never used again. End of the first page. You look up for a moment, hesitating to turn the next page. Already you suspect what is coming. You turn the page. I constructed the first time machine a week ago. My calculations had told me that it would work, but not how it would work. I had expected it to send an object back in time. It works backward in time only, not forward, physically unchanged and intact. My first experiment showed me my error. I placed a cube of metal in the machine. It was miniature of the one you just walked out of, and set the machine to go backward 10 years. I flicked the switch and opened the door, expecting to find the cube vanished. Instead, I found it had crumbled to powder. I put in another cube and sent it 2 years back. The second cube came back unchanged, except that it was newer, shinier. That gave me the answer. I had been expecting the cubes to go back in time, and they had done so, but not in the sense I had expected them to. Those metal cubes had been fabricated about 3 years previously. I had sent the first one back years before it had existed in its fabricated form. 10 years ago, it had been ore. The machine returned it to that state. Do you see how our previous theories of time travel have been wrong? We expected to be able to step into a time machine in, say, 2004, set it for 50 years back, and then step out in the year 1954. But it does not work that way. The machine does not move in time. Only whatever is within the machine is affected, and then just with relation to itself, and not to the rest of the universe. I confirmed this with guinea pigs by sending one 6 weeks old 5 weeks back, and it came out a baby. I need not outline all my experiments here. You will find a record of them in the desk, and you can study it later. Do you understand now what has happened to you, Norman? You begin to understand, and you begin to sweat. The I who wrote that letter you are now reading is you, yourself at the age of 75 in this year of 2004. You are that 75-year-old man, with your body returned to what it had been 50 years ago, with all the memories of 50 years of living wiped out. You invented the time machine. And before you used it on yourself, you made these arrangements to help you orient yourself. You wrote yourself the letter, which you're now reading. But if those 50 years are, to you, gone, what of all your friends, those you loved? What of your parents? What of the girl you were going, to marry? You read on. Yes, you will want to know what has happened. Mum died in 1963, Dad in 1968. You married Barbara in 1956. I'm sorry to tell you that she died only 3 years later in a plane crash. You have one son. He is still living. His name is Walter. He is now 46 years old and is an accountant in Kansas City. Tears come into your eyes, and for a moment you can no longer read. Barbara dead. Dead for 45 years. And only minutes ago, in subjective time, you were sitting next to her, sitting in the bright sun in a Beverly Hills patio. You force yourself to read again. But back to the discovery. You begin to see some of its implications. You will need time to think to see all of them. It does not permit time travel as we have thought of time travel, but it gives us immortality of a sort. Immortality of the kind I have temporarily given us. Is it good? Is it worthwhile to lose the memory of 50 years of one's life in order to return one's body to relative youth? The only way I can find out is to try, as soon as I have finished writing this and made my other preparations. You will know the answer. But before you decide, remember that there is another problem, more important than the psychological one. I mean overpopulation. If our discovery is given to the world, if all who are old or dying can make themselves young again, the population will almost double every generation. Nor would the world, not even our own relatively enlightened country, be willing to accept compulsory birth control as a solution. Give this to the world, as the world is today in 2004, and within a generation there will be famine, suffering, war, perhaps a complete collapse of civilization. Yes, we have reached other planets, but they are not suitable for colonizing. The stars may be our answer, but we're a long way from reaching them. When we do someday, the billions of habitable planets that must be out there will be our answer, our living room. But until then, what is the answer? Destroy the machine? But think of the countless lives it can save, the suffering it can prevent. Think of what it would mean to a man dying of cancer. Think. You finish the letter and put it down. You think of Barbara dead for 45 years, and of the fact that you were married to her for 3 years and that those years are lost to you. 50 years lost. You damn the old man of 75 whom you became, and who has done this to you, who has given you this decision to make. Bitterly, you know what the decision must be. You think that he knew too, and realize that he could safely leave it in your hands. Damn him! He should have known. Too valuable to destroy, too dangerous to give. The other answer is painfully obvious. You must be custodian of this discovery and keep it secret until it is safe to give, until mankind has expanded to the stars and has new worlds to populate, or until, even without that, he has reached a state of civilization where he can avoid overpopulation by rationing births to the number of accidental or voluntary deaths. If neither of those things has happened in another 50 years, and are they likely so soon, then you, at 75, will be writing another letter like this one. You will be undergoing another experience similar to the one you're going through now, and making the same decision, of course. Why not? You'll be the same person again. Time and again, to preserve this secret until man is ready for it. How often will you again sit at a desk like this one, thinking the thoughts you are thinking now, feeling the grief you now feel? There is a click at the door, and you know that the time lock has opened, that you are now free to leave this room, free to start a new life for yourself in place of the one you have already lived and lost. But you are in no hurry now to walk directly through that door. You sit there, staring straight ahead of you blindly, seeing in your mind's eye the vista of a set of facing mirrors, like those in an old-fashioned barber shop, reflecting the same thing over and over again, diminishing into far distance. The end. Subscribe for more at storiesoffuturespast.substack.com. And now for the next story. Delayed Action by Charles V. DeVet, originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, September 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. It was just a hunch. Johnson knew that, but his hunches had often paid off in the past, and now he waited with a big man's patience. For 5 hours he sat in the wooden stands under the rumpled canvas the concessionaries had put up to protect the tourist from Marlock's yellow sun. The sun was hot, and soon Johnson's clothing was marked with large soiled patches of sweat. Now and then a light breeze blew across the stands from the native section, and at each breath his nostrils crinkled in protest at the acrid smell. Marlock wasn't much of a planet. Its one claim to fame was its widely advertised Nature's Mobius strip. For 18 months of the year, 9 months of sub-zero cold, and 9 months of sultry sand-driven summer, the only outsiders to visit the planet came to buy its one export, the fur of the desert ox. But during the 2 months of fall and 2 months of spring, the tourists poured in to gape at the strip. Idly, for the 100th time, Johnson let his gaze run over the tourists lining up for the thrill journey out onto the strip. Most of them wouldn't go far. They only wanted to be able to say they'd been on it. They would build up some pretty exciting stories about it by the time they returned home. There was no sign of Johnson's man. The party started out onto the strip. At the first sensation of giddiness, women squealed and most of them turned back. Their men came with them, secretly relieved at the excuse. Johnson watched disinterestedly until only 2 remained, the young couple he had designated in his mind as honeymooners. The girl had grit, perhaps more than the young fellow with her. He was affecting bored bravado, laughing loudly as the girl hesitated, but white streaks had appeared along his jawline and across his temples as he waited his turn. The young couple had gone far enough out now so that they were in the first bend of the strip's twisting dip. Already their bodies were leaning sharply as the mysterious gravity of the strip held them perpendicular with a pathway. From where he sat, Johnson could read nausea on their faces. When they had followed the strip around until they were leaning at a 35-degree angle, the girl seemed to lose her nerve. She stopped and stood gripping the guide rope with both hands. The boys said something to her, but she shook her head. He'd have to show his superiority now by going on, but it wouldn't be for much farther. Johnson was willing to wager. The boy took 3 more steps and paused. Then his body bent in the middle and he was sick. He'd had enough. Both turned and hurried back. The crowd of tourists, watching or waiting their turn, cheered. In a few minutes, Johnson knew the kid would be thinking of himself as a hero. Suddenly Johnson straightened up, having spotted a new arrival, who gripped a tan briefcase tightly under one arm, buying a ticket. He had bulky shoulders and a black beard. Johnson's man had come. When he saw the bearded man go out with the next bunch to brave the strip, Johnson rose and walked rapidly to the entrance. Elbowing his way through, with a murmured apology, he joined the waiting group. A thin-faced odd-job man opened the rope gate, and they shuffled through. The group must have walked 50 paces, with the bearded man well up in front, and Johnson somewhere in the middle, before Johnson's stomach sent him his first warning of unrest. Most of those ahead had stopped, and Johnson threaded his way carefully past them. Another 25 steps, and he left the others behind. All except the bearded man. He neither paused nor looked back. Johnson's stomach had drawn up into a tight knot now, and his head was beginning to feel light. There was a faint ringing in his ears. By the time he reached the end of the guide rope, Nausea was creeping up from his stomach and into his throat. This was as far as it was supposed to be safe to go. The advertising literature had it that here was the point of no return. Up ahead his quarry was walking half doubled over, weaving back and forth, as though he were intoxicated. But he did not pause. Johnson turned to look back, and felt his breakfast fighting to come up. From his perspective, the ground and the spectators watching him had swung to a position almost perpendicular to him. He felt that he was about to slide off into space. A wave of vertigo swept over him, his legs folded, and he fell to the ground, sicker than he had ever been before in his life. Now he knew why the man ahead never looked back. For a moment Johnson wondered whether he should give up. But, even as he debated, tenacity pulled him to his feet and forced him on. And now something new was added to his vast discomfort. Tiny twinges of pain, like small electric shocks, began shooting up his legs, increasing his intensity with each step he took. The pain built up until the rusty taste of blood in his mouth told him that he had bitten into the flesh of his lower lip. Johnson's only consolation now was the thought that the man ahead of him must be suffering worse than he. At each step the pain increased its tempo, and the sound within his head grew to a battering roar. Although he felt himself at the last frayed ends of his vitality, he managed to stagger on. Abruptly he realized that he had very nearly overtaken the man ahead. Through eyes glazed with pain, he saw the other, still standing, but swaying with agony and sickness. The man seemed to be gathering his resources for some supreme effort. He tottered ahead 2 more steps, threw himself forward, and disappeared. If he paused now, Johnson knew he would never be able to move again. Only willpower and momentum carried him on. He stumbled and pitched forward. A searing pain traced a path through his head, and he felt himself falling. He was certain that he had never lost consciousness. The ground came up to meet him, and, with a last effort, he twisted his right shoulder inward. His cheek slid along the dirt, and he lay on his side without strength. His legs pushed forward in a steady jerking movement as he fought to quiet his quivering muscles. Gradually, a soothing lethargy bathed Johnson's body. His pains vanished, and the sickness left his stomach. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Slowly he climbed to his feet and stood looking about him. He was still on the narrow arm of the strip. On either side of him, banks of white clouds, with the consistency of thick smoke, billowed and curled about the strip, but somehow they left its pathway clear. Johnson shook his head. The wrongness, he guessed, was in his own mind, but he was unable to determine what it was. Desperately he marshalled his scattered thoughts. Nothing. He took one groping step in the direction from which he had come, and staggered back from a wall of pain as tangible as a concrete structure. He had no choice except to go forward. There was something he must do, he realized, but what was it? With the question came the answer to what was troubling him. His memory was gone. Or, at least, a great gap had been torn through it as though carved out by a giant blade. Briefly, despair threatened to overwhelm him. "Hold it," Johnson spoke aloud, and the words sobered him. All fears became worse when not looked at. He had to bring this disaster out into the open where he could face it, where he could assay the damage. He had always taken pride in having a logical mind, with thought processes as clear and orderly as a bookkeeper's ledger. Closing his eyes, he went swiftly over his recollections, placing each in its appropriate column. When he finished, he found the balance extremely unfavourable, but not hopeless. On the asset side he remembered his name, Donald Johnson. Right now he was on nature's Mobius strip on the planet Marlock. There was some man he had been following. The rest was on the liability side of his balance sheet. His name remained. All other memory of his own identity was gone. There was no recollection of his reason for being on Marlock, or whom he had been following, or why. That left him little with which to work. On the other hand, he mused, he might never be able to get off the strip, so that didn't matter so much. He doubted his ability to stand the stress of penetrating that electric curtain again. His body had been able to take the punishment the first time because the force had built up gradually. Going back would be something else again. Still, he planned his next actions methodically. Only in that way could he retain his sanity. He would go forward for 1 hour, he decided. He checked his wristwatch and discovered it had run down, and, if he found nothing, he would return and take his chances on getting through the curtain. At the end of 10 minutes, he sighted land ahead of him. When he stepped off the strip, he stopped in amazement. Somehow the strip had doubled back on itself, and he had returned to his starting place. To his right was the rough wooden viewing platform with its green umbrella gone. The stands were empty, and not a person, tourist or concessionaire, was in sight. As Johnson stood, perplexed, he became aware of numbness spreading over his body. He brought up his hands and watched them slowly turn blue with cold. He realized then, in a burst of wonder, that winter had come to Marlock. Yet it had been spring when he had gone out on the strip. "Good God, man!" the clerk exclaimed. "Have you been out in that cold without a coat and hat? It must be 30 below." Johnson was unable to answer. He had run from the strip. Luckily he remembered its location in relation to the town, but it must have been over a mile to the hotel. Now, as he stamped his feet and beat at his sides with numbed hands, he breathed heavily, gasping great gulps of air into his tortured lungs. "Come and warm yourself," the clerk said, leading him over to a hot water radiator. Johnson made no protest. He let the heat penetrate until it scorched the skin on his back. Only after the coldness left his body and was replaced by a drowsy inertia did his attention return to the clerk. "Did you ever see me before?" Johnson asked. The clerk shook his head. "Not that I know of." Any further investigation would have to wait until the next day, Johnson decided. He was dead tired, and he had to have some sleep. "Sign me up for a room, will you?" he asked. Once up in his room, Johnson counted his money. 154 credits. Enough to buy winter clothing and pay his room and board for a week, maybe 2. What would he do if he could learn nothing about himself before then? The next day Johnson left the hotel to buy warm clothes. The town's only store was a half-block down the street, as he remembered it, one of the big Interplanet Company stores. Johnson waited until the storekeeper finished with 2 of the hairy-eared natives before giving his order. As he paid for the purchase, he asked, "Have you ever seen me before?" The storekeeper glanced at him uneasily and shifted his feet before answering. "Am I supposed to have?" Johnson ignored the question. "Where can I find the manager?" he asked, slipping into the heavy coat the clerk held for him. "Go up that stairway by the door," the clerk said. "You'll find him in his office." The manager was an old man. old and black, with a deep blackness only an earthborn African possesses. But his eyes retained their youthful alertness. "Come in and sit down," he told Johnson as he looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. Johnson walked over and took the chair at the manager's left. "I've had an accident," he said without preliminary, "and I seem to have lost my memory. Do you, by any chance, know who I am?" "Never saw you before in my life," the manager answered. "What's your name?" "Don Johnson." "Well, at least you remember something," the old man said shrewdly. "You didn't come during the last 6 months, if that'll help any. There have been only 2 ships in that time, both the company's. I meet all company ships. If you came in during the tourist season, I wouldn't know." "Where else could I make inquiries?" "Son," the old man said kindly, "there's 3 Earthmen on Marlock that I know of, besides yourself, of course, the clerk at the hotel, my storekeeper, and myself. If you started asking questions at the hotel, you're at the end of the line now." Something in Johnson's expression caused the old man to go on. "How you fixed for money, son?" Johnson drew a deep breath. "I've got enough to last me about 2 weeks. The manager hesitated and carefully surveyed the ceiling with his eyes before he spoke again. "I've always felt we Earthmen should stick together," he said. "If you want a job, I'll find something for you to do and put you on the payroll." 20 minutes later, Johnson took the job, and 20 years later he was still working for the company. He worked for them until... Johnson was glad, when the first twinge of fear came, that it brought no panic. Instead, it washed through his body, sharpening his reflexes and alerting his muscles for action. He never ceased to wonder about this faculty he had acquired for sensing the presence of danger. There was no doubt in his mind that it had come into active function through the influence of his environment, but it must have been an intrinsic part of him even before that, waiting to be activated. A moment before he had localized the source of his uneasiness, an Earthman, following perhaps 50 paces behind him. The one quick glance Johnson had allowed himself told him his follower was above average in height, and lean, with a wiry, muscular command of himself that marked him as a man capable of well-coordinated action. He fought the rising force of the next sandblaster boiling in from the desert, until he was unable to take a step against it. Then he moved behind a mud-packed arm projecting from the native dwelling at his right. Every building had one of these protecting arms added on. Even the concrete buildings in the newer, earth-built section of the city conformed to the custom. The sandstorms raged intermittently on Marlock through the entire 9 months summer season, and could not be ignored, either by visitors or natives. Johnson huddled against a projection, but the sand whipped around the corner and pounded at his back. Fine grains sifted through his clothing and mingled with the clammy sweat of his body. He resisted the frantic urge to scratch his itching, tormented skin, for he knew the flesh would be rubbed raw in a minute and increase the irritation to maddening proportions. As the sandblaster lost its intensity, he came out from his shelter and walked away as rapidly as a diminishing force of the wind would permit. If he could reach his office before his stalker closed in, he would be safe. Suddenly, a second Earthman, a short length of pipe in his right hand, came out of a doorway across the street and ran toward him. Johnson realized that here was the source of the warning his intuition had sent, not the man behind him. For a brief instant he weighed the situation. The man was equipped for assault, but the chances were he was interested only in robbery.
Johnson could probably save himself a beating by surrendering his money without resistance. He rejected the thought. A man had to live with his pride and his self-respect that were more necessary than physical well-being. Setting his shoulders firmly against the wall, he waited. The man slowed to a walk when he saw his intended victim on guard. Johnson had the chance to observe him closely. He was a short and dark man, heavy of bone, with the lower half of his face thickly bearded, and sweat making a thin glistening film on his high cheekbones. Abruptly, a voice said, "I wouldn't touch him if I were you." Johnson followed the gaze of his near attacker to his left, where the lean man he had noted before stood with a flat blue pistol pointed in their direction. He held the pistol like a man who knew how to use it. "A gun!" the man in the street gasped. "Are you crazy?" "Better put it away, fast," Johnson warned his ally. "If the native police catch you with that gun, you're in bad trouble." The lean man hesitated a moment, then shrugged and pocketed the gun, but he kept his hand in the pocket. "I can still use it," he said to no one in particular. "Look, chum," the bearded thug grated, "you're evidently a stranger here. Let me give you a tip. If you get caught using a gun, or even having one on you, the police'll slap you in jail with an automatic sentence of 10 years. An Earthman couldn't stay alive in one of their so-called jails for a year. Now I've got a little business to attend to with Mr. Johnson, and I don't want any interference. So be smart and run along." The smile never left the stranger's face. "Right now," he said, "I am interested in seeing that Mr. Johnson remains in good health. If you take another step toward him, I'll shoot. And if I'm not successful in evading the police afterwards, you won't be alive to know it." "You're bluffing," the bearded man said. "Let me point out something," Johnson interrupted. "Suppose he is bluffing and doesn't use the gun. The odds are still 2-1 against you. Are you sure you could handle both of us, even with the help of that pipe?" The man wasn't sure. He stood undecided, then his face showed black frustration. He mouthed a few choice phrases through his beard, turned and walked away. The lean man extended his hand. "My name's Alton Hawks." The rising whine of the next sandblaster drowned out Johnson's answer. He drew his new acquaintance into the shelter of a sand arm. As they hugged the corner, they felt a third body press against them. The musky odor, mingled with the taint of old leather, told Johnson that their companion was a native. The storm eased its force, and the two Earthmen raised their heads to regard the corner's other occupant. He was a mahogany brown, almost the exact color of the ankle-length leather skirt he wore. "Man, he stinks," Hawks said. The visitor spread his hairy, wide-nostriled nose into the native equivalent of a smile. His hairy ears twitched with pleasure, and he swelled his chest. "Blee strong all over," he said. "Want him guard?" "Why not?" Johnson answered, glancing inquiringly at Hawks. He slipped a coin into the extended brown palm. "Guard us until we get to the big house section." "Pale smells be very safe," the native said. They left their shelter as the wind died down and started toward the taller buildings of the foreign section. "I must have said the right thing when I said he stinks," Hawks remarked. "Telling a native that is the same thing, to him, as calling him strong and virile," Johnson answered. "They admit, reluctantly, that we foreigners have some good fighting qualities, but we're still regarded as unmanly because of our weak odor. Their females wouldn't look twice at either of us." When they reached one of the few three-story structures in the city, Johnson dismissed their guard. They entered the building and walked down a short corridor and through a door lettered "Donald H. Johnson, District Manager, Interplanets Trade Company." "To be frank with you," Hawkes said, as he eased his lank body into the chair Johnson offered, "I had planned to learn more about your local activities before I introduced myself. However, I've found in the past that my first judgment of a man is usually right, so I think I'll get down to business immediately." He drew a set of papers from an inside pocket and tossed them on the desk in front of Johnson. "I'm a company secret service man," he said. Johnson raised his eyebrows, but looked at the papers without comment. He glanced up at Hawkes. "Do you recognize either of the men in the pictures?" Hawkes asked, when he saw that Johnson had no intention of speaking. Unhurriedly, Johnson picked up the papers and removed a rubber binder. He pulled out 2 photos and laid them on the desk in front of him. "The bearded one is the man who waylaid me," he said. "Of course." "Look at both a little closer," Hawkes suggested, "and see if you don't notice something else." Johnson studied the pictures. "There's no doubt about the first," he murmured. "Evidently I'm supposed to recognize the other also." Abruptly he sat erect. "They're both the same man," he exclaimed. "Only in the second picture he's clean-shaven." Hawkes nodded. "There's a story about those 2 pictures," he said. "But first, let me fill you in on some background. You know that Interplanets has branches on more than 1,000 worlds. Because of this widespread operation, it's particularly vulnerable to robbery. But it would cost more than the company's earnings to post adequate guards on every station, and it would be impractical to depend on the protection of the local governments, many of which are extremely primitive. On the other hand, allowing themselves to be robbed with impunity would be financial suicide." Johnson nodded. "Of course." "That," Hawkes continued, "is where the company's secret service comes in. It never lets up on the effort it will make to solve a robbery and bring the perpetrators to justice, and it never quits once it begins an investigation. That policy has proven very effective in discouraging thievery. During the company's entire tenure, there have been less than a dozen unsolved thefts, and 2 of them occurred right here on Marlock." "I was a clerk with the company at the time of the second," Johnson said reminiscently. "Been with them about 3 years then. That must have been over 20 years ago. He paused and looked down. "I remember," he said. "The picture without the beard. That's the thief. The photograph was taken by one of the automatic cameras set up for just that purpose. We still use them. But they never found the man." "That's right," Hawkes agreed. "The robbery occurred a little over 20 years ago, and the other picture you have was taken at the time of the first robbery, approximately 25 years before that." "But it isn't possible," Johnson protested. "These pictures are of the same man, and there's obviously no 25-year spread in age between them, unless one is the other's father or a relative that resembles him very closely," Hawkes finished. "Look at the pictures again. There's the same scar on both foreheads, the same pockmark on the right cheek. Our special section has even made measurements of the comparative sizes of the nose, ears, and other features. There's no possible doubt that the pictures are of the same man." "How do you explain it?" Johnson asked. "I don't," Hawkes replied quietly. "That's one of the things I'm here to learn. But did you notice this? The man we encountered this afternoon was not only the same as the one on those pictures, he still looks the same." We might, for the sake of argument, grant that a man's appearance would change only slightly in 25 years, but when you add another 23 on top of that, and he's still unchanged. If you're certain that he's the man, why don't you arrest him? Johnson asked. Can we arrest a man apparently about 30 years old and accuse him of a crime committed 48 years ago, or even 23 years ago? I suppose not, Johnson agreed. What do you intend to do? I haven't decided yet. First, I'll have to learn more about the situation here. You can help me with that. Right now, I'd like to know something about the native customs, especially in regards to legal matters. Their laws are fairly simple, Johnson began. There's no law against stealing or taking by force anything you can get away with. That sounds absurd by Earth standards. It prevents the amassing of more goods than an individual needs and makes for fairly equitable distribution. If a native somehow acquires a sudden amount of wealth, goods in their case, he must hire guards to protect it. Guarding is a major occupation. They do an especially big business during the tourist seasons. In time, the pay of the guards will eat up any native's surplus. Either way, by loss or guard pay, the wealth is soon redistributed. Can they even kill one another with impunity? No, the laws are rigid in that respect. In the process of relieving another of his property, they must neither break a major bone nor inflict permanent damage. If they disobey, they are tortured to death in the public square. Hawkes asked, Who enforces their law? One of the clans. Its members are supported in their duties by all the others, and there's a permanent open season on murderers. Anyone, police or civilian, may revenge a victim. How about the law against carrying firearms? With them, intent is tantamount to commission, Johnson replied. Only foreigners are ever foolish enough to be caught armed. However, all native laws apply to them also. The only concession the company has been able to force is that a foreign offender isn't tortured. He's put in jail for 10 years. No one ever lived to come out. I see, Hawkes said. Interesting. However, the immediate situation is this. I've been sent here because the service received reports that our bearded friend had made another appearance, and we believe it's safe to assume that he's here to attempt a third robbery. Right now, we'll have to pass over his trick of longevity. Our problem is to catch him in the act. When do you think he'll make his play? It'll have to be some time before tomorrow noon, Johnson answered. Under our setup, we accept furs from the natives whenever they're brought in, but we pay off only once a year. That way, I'm not burdened with guarding money the whole year around. I have well over 50,000 credits in the safe now, and tomorrow I begin paying off. Then we'll have to be ready for him, Hawkes said, though I don't expect him until tonight. Probably just about the time you're ready to close. He'll need you to open the safe. I can count on your help? Johnson nodded. That night, as they waited in his office, Johnson turned to Hawkes. I've been giving some thought to what you told me this afternoon about the robberies. I have a theory that might account for some of the things we don't understand. Yes? Hawkes looked closely at Johnson. You've probably heard of a tourist attraction called Nature's Mobius Strip. As far as we know, no one has ever gone beyond a certain point and returned. Suppose there's a time flaw at that point, and the bearded man has somehow learned about it. Suppose anyone completing the Mobius circle and returning finds, say, 20 years have elapsed, while to him only a few minutes have passed. Go on. Hawkes leaned forward intently. He makes his first hold-up Johnson continued, and goes around the strip. When he comes out 20 years later, they're no longer looking for him. He leaves Marlock, and during the next 5 years he goes through the money he stole. He returns and repeats the process. This time the money lasts only 3 years. Now he's back to try it again. Do you see how that would tie everything up in a neat little package? Hawkes smiled as he relaxed and sat back. A bit too neat, he said. Also, you don't have an ounce of concrete evidence to back up your theory. That's right, I don't, Johnson agreed. Outside the door, a board creaked. Johnson glanced quickly across the room to where Hawkes sat with a pistol on his lap. Hawkes's eyebrows raised, but he made no sound. Suddenly the door was kicked open, and the black-bearded stranger stood framed in the doorway. "Raise 'em!" he barked. The gun in his hand was aimed at Johnson. The man took 2 steps into the room. Hawkes shifted slightly in his chair, and the gunman's head swiveled in his direction. The slug from Hawkes's pistol made a small blue hole in the upper left corner of his forehead. The thug's face tipped up, shocked and unbelieving. He swayed slowly before he fell backward, his body rigid. His fur cap flew from his head as he struck the floor. "I thought we'd better play it safe," Hawkes said as he rose and walked over to the fallen man. He slipped his gun into his pocket before he bent and picked up the cap at his feet. He dropped it over the upturned face. For a long moment the silence held thin as the 2 men looked at each other. Hawkes stood, wiping his right hand on his trouser leg. Johnson toyed idly with a gun he had picked up from the desk in front of him. Finally Hawkes let his body sag into a chair at Johnson's right. "This is always a dirty business," he said sourly. Johnson sat down also. "Did you notice the look on his face when he saw you and you shot him?" he asked, abstractedly turning the pistol in his hand. "Funny thing. In that half-second before he fell, an article I read somewhere flashed into my mind. It seems that during the French Revolution, a certain doctor got to wondering just how long a man's brain remained active after his head had been cut off. He persuaded some of his friends who were due to be guillotined to cooperate in a series of tests. Each man was to keep blinking his eyes as long as possible after his head left his body, as a sign that he was still conscious. The doctor counted as high as 6 winks. "Very interesting, I'm sure," Hawkes said guardedly, "but a bit morbid, isn't it?" "I was wondering," Johnson went on, as though he had not heard the other, "whether he was still conscious for that instant after you shot him, and if that brought the look of surprise to his face." Hawkes turned in his chair to face Johnson fully. "You're driving at something," he said sharply. "Get to the point." "Personally, I've wondered at a few things about you myself," Johnson said. He held the gun steadily in his hand now, no longer pretending to play with it. "I told you that our second robbery occurred while I was a clerk with the company," he went on. "They jerked me into the Home Office, and for a while I had a pretty rough time. You know, when I joined the company, I was an amnesiac. I remembered my name, but that's about all." "No, I didn't know," Hawkes muttered, growing slightly paler. "I learned then from the Home Office that I had been a member of their Secret Service some 20 years earlier. I had been sent here to investigate the first robbery, and I had disappeared. Naturally, they had suspected me. However, they had no evidence, and when I reappeared 20 years later, they played it smart by just waiting, instead of arresting me. When the second robbery occurred, they closed in. The only thing that saved me was the fact that tests proved my memory was really gone, and that I had told the truth, as I knew it, from the few scraps of information I retained about being out on the Mobius strip. They and I arrived at the theory I mentioned a short time ago. I was sent back here to wait. The company never gives up. Remember? Are you insinuating that I was in cahoots with this fellow here? Hawks asked harshly. I'd say it was more than an insinuation, Johnson replied. You made several other slips. In the first place, Secret Servicemen are usually better informed about a situation they're investigating than you seem to be. Also, those identification papers you showed me were faked. The skin along the bridge of Hawks's nose had drawn tight, and now his lips grew narrower. In that case, why did I save you from that man this afternoon? He asked. And why would I shoot him now? You saving me was an act to get into my confidence. You shot him so you wouldn't have to split the loot. I figure you were in with him on the second robbery also. There had to be someone, because his memory would be gone when he came off the strip. But you weren't satisfied. Together you decided to pull off another robbery while you were here and double the spoils. Then you decided you wanted it all for yourself, and you shot him. There's one big flaw in your reasoning, Hawks pointed out. How did I plan to get away? The only ships leaving here for several months belong to the company. Do you think I'd be foolish enough to expect them to let me slip out on one of their ships? No, I think you intended to go out on the strip yourself. All right, then, Hawks countered. You admitted that this was a two-man job. How could I protect myself when I returned if I knew in advance that I wouldn't know who I was, let alone what I had done? I'll come back to that in a minute, Johnson said. But now I'd advise you to drop your gun on the floor and give yourself up. You've got nothing to gain by carrying on the bluff. You know I'll never let you get to the strip. And once I put you on the ship, the company will take over. Hawks's shoulders drooped. Finally he smiled raggedly. There's no use my arguing any longer, he said. But you've made the mistake of underestimating me, my friend. I've lost my gamble, that's all. You have nothing on me. I'm not as ignorant of native law as I may have pretended. Granted, I am carrying a lethal weapon, but I'm on private property. That's legal. I shot a man, but only in defense of my own life. His gun on the floor will prove he came in armed, so I'm clean as far as the natives are concerned, right? Johnson nodded. And as for the company, what will they hold me for? They can't prove any connection between me and him. Hawks indicated the man on the floor. And this robbery, it never actually came off. Earth laws don't allow prosecution for an intent. Now, where does that leave you? Johnson stood up. You're right, as far as you went, he said. But, returning to your earlier question about one man pulling this job, I asked myself how I would do it if it had to be done alone. And I found a way. You'd probably figure the same one. Now, I'll take that paper in your pocket. It will serve very well as a confession. Suddenly Hawks's right hand streaked toward a side pocket. Johnson leaned forward and brought the flat of his gun across the other's temple. As Hawks sagged, Johnson ripped open his coat and took out a sealed envelope. He removed the sheet of paper and read, This has been written for my own information. My name is Alton Hawks. I have robbed the Interplanets Company and gone out on the strip with the money. When I read this, my memory will be gone, and 20 years will have elapsed.
The end. Subscribe for more at storiesoffuturespast.substack.com. And now for the next story. Transfer Point by Anthony Boucher. Originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction, November 1950. Narrated by Tom Trussel. There were 3 of them in the retreat, 3 out of all mankind safe from the deadly yellow bands. The great Kurth Laborie himself had constructed the retreat and its extraordinary air conditioning, not because his scientific genius had foreseen the coming of the poisonous element agnaton and the end of the human race, but because he itched. And here Verco sat, methodically recording the destruction of mankind, once in a straight factual record for the instruction of future readers, if any, he added wryly to himself, and again as a canto in that epic poem of man, which he never expected to complete, but for which he lived. Lavra's long golden hair fell over his shoulders. It was odd that its scent distracted him when he was at work on the factual record, yet seemed to wing the lines of the epic. "But why bother?" she asked. Her speech might have been clearer if her tongue had not been more preoccupied with the savour of the apple than with the articulation of words. But Verco understood readily. The remark was as familiar an opening as P to K4 in chess. "It's my duty," Verco explained patiently. "I haven't your father's scientific knowledge and perception." "Your father's? I haven't the knowledge of his humblest lab assistant. But I can put words together so that they make sense, and sometimes more than sense. And I have to do this." From Lavra's plump red lips an apple pip fell into the works of the electronic typewriter. Verco fished it out automatically. This too was part of the gambit, with the possible variants of grapeseed, orange peel. "But why?" Lavra demanded petulantly. "Won't father let us leave here? A girl might as well be in a convent," Verco suggested. He was a good amateur paleolinguist. "There is an analogy. Even despite my presence, convents were supposed to shelter girls from the perils of the world. Now the whole world is one great peril, outside of this retreat." "Go on," Lavra urged. She had long ago learned, Verco suspected, that he was a faintly over-serious young man with no small talk, and that she could enjoy his full attention only by asking to have something explained, even if for the nth time. He smiled and thought of the girls he used to talk with, not at, and of how little breath they had for talking now, in the world where no one drew an unobstructed breath. It had begun with the accidental discovery in a routine laboratory analysis of a new element in the air, an inert gas which the great paleolinguist Larkish had named agnoton, the unknown thing, after the pattern of the similar nicknames given to others, neon, the new thing, xenon, the strange thing. It had continued. The explanation ran off so automatically that his mind was free to range from the next line of the epic to the interesting question of whether the presence of earlobes would damage the symmetry of Lavra's perfect face. It had continued with the itching and sneezing, the coughing and wheezing, with the increase of percentage of agnaton in the atmosphere, promptly passing any other inert gas, even argon, and soon rivaling oxygen itself. And it had culminated. No, the lines were cleaner without lobes. On that day when only the 3 of them were here in this retreat, with the discovery that the human race was allergic to agnaton. Allergies had been conquered for a decade of generations. Their cure, even their palliation, had been forgotten, and mankind coughed and sneezed and itched, and died. For a while, the allergies of the ancient past produced only agonies to make the patient long for death. Agnaton brought on racking and incessant spasms of coughing and sneezing, which no heart could long withstand. "So if you leave this shelter, my dear," Verko concluded, "you too will fight for every breath and twist your body in torment until your heart decides that it is all just too much trouble. Here we are safe, because your father's eczema was the only known case of allergy in centuries, and was traced to the inert gases. Here is the only air conditioning in the world that excludes the inert gases, and with them Agnaton. And here—" Lavra leaned forward, a smile and a red fleck of apple skin on her lips, the apples of her breasts touching Verko's shoulders. This, too, was part of the gambit. Usually it was merely declined. Tersa stood between them. Tersa, who sang well and talked better, whose plain face and beautiful throat were alike racked by Agnaton. This time the gambit was interrupted. Kurth Labbery himself had come in unnoticed. His old voice was thin with weariness, sharp with impatience. "And here we are, safe in perpetuity, with our air conditioning, our energy plant, our hydroponics, safe in perpetual siege, besieged by an inert gas." Verko grinned. "Undignified, isn't it?" Kurth Labbery managed to laugh at himself. "Damn your secretarial hide, Verko. I love you like a son, but if I had one man who knew a meson from a metazoon to help me in the laboratory—" "You'll find something, father," Lavra said vaguely. Her father regarded her with an odd seriousness. "Lavra," he said, "your beauty is the greatest thing that I have wrought, with a certain assistance I'll grant from the genes so obviously carried by your mother. That beauty alone still has meaning. The sight of you would bring a momentary happiness even to a man choking in his last spasms, while a great web of civilization—" He absently left the sentence unfinished and switched on the video screen. He had to try a dozen channels before he found one that was still casting. When every erg of a man's energy goes to drawing his next breath, he cannot tend his machine. At last, Kurth Labbery picked up a New York newscast. The announcer was sneezing badly. The older literature, Verko observed, found sneezing comic, but still contriving to speak, and somewhere a group of technicians must have had partial control of themselves. 472 planes have crashed, the announcer said, in the past 48 hours. Civil authorities have forbidden further plane travel indefinitely because of the danger of spasms at the controls, and it is rumored that all vehicular transport whatsoever is to come under the same ban. No rock clipper has arrived from Lund for over a week, and it is 36 hours since we have made contact with the Lund telestation. Europe has been silent for over 2 days, and Asia a week. The most serious threat of this epidemic, the head of the Academy has said in an authorized statement, is the complete disruption of the systems of communication upon which world civilization is based, when man becomes physically incapable of governing his machines. It was then that they saw the first of the yellow bands. It was just that, a band of bright yellow, some 30 centimeters wide, about 5 meters long, and so thin as to seem insubstantial, a mere stripe of colour. It came underneath the backdrop behind the announcer. It streaked about the casting room with questing sinuosity. No features, no appendages relieved its yellow blankness. Then, with a deft whipping motion, it wrapped itself around the announcer. It held him only an instant. His hideously shriveled body plunged toward the camera as the screen went dead. That was the start of the horror. Verco, naturally, had no idea of the origin of the yellow bands. Even Kurth Laborie could offer no more than conjectures. From another planet, another system, another galaxy, another universe. It did not matter. Precise knowledge had now lost its importance. Kurth Laborie was almost as indifferent to the problem as was Lavra. He speculated on it out of sheer habit. What signified was that the yellow bands were alien, and that they were rapidly and precisely completing the destruction of mankind begun by the Agnaton. "Their arrival immediately after the epidemic," Kurth Laborie concluded, "cannot be coincidence. You will observe that they function freely in an Agnaton-laden atmosphere." "It would be interesting," Verco commented, "to visualize a band sneezing." "It's possible," the scientist corrected, "that the Agnaton was a poison gas barrage laid down to soften Earth for their coming. But it is likely that they could know that a gas harmless to them would be lethal to other life. It's more probable that they learned from spectroscopic analysis that the atmosphere of Earth lacked an element essential to them, which they supplied before invading." Verco considered the problem, while Lavra sliced a peach with delicate grace. She was unable to resist licking the juice from her fingers. "Then if the Agnaton," he ventured, "is something that they imported, is it possible that their supply might run short?" Kurth Laborie fiddled with the dials under the screen. It was still possible to pick up occasional glimpses from remote sectors, though by now the heart sickened in advance at the knowledge of the inevitable end of the cast. "It is possible, Verco. It is the only hope. The three of us here, where the Agnaton and the yellow bands are alike helpless to enter, may continue our self-sufficient existence long enough to outlast the invaders. Perhaps somewhere on Earth there are other such nuclei, but I doubt it. We are the whole of the future, and I am old." Verco frowned. He resented the terrible weight of a burden that he did not want but could not reject. He felt himself at once oppressed and ennobled. Lavra went on eating her peach. The video screen sprang into light. A young man with a tense, lined face of premature age spoke hastily, urgency. "To all of you, if there are any of you, I have heard no answer for 2 days now. It is chance that I am here, but watch, all of you. I have found how the yellow bands came here. I'm going to turn the camera on it now. Watch." The field of vision panned to something that was for a moment totally incomprehensible. "This is their ship," the old young man gasped. It was a set of bars of a metal almost exactly the color of the bands themselves, and it appeared in the first instant like a 3-dimensional projection of a tesseract. Then, as they looked at it, their eyes seemed to follow strange new angles. Possibilities of vision opened up beyond their capacities. For a moment, they seemed to see what the human eye was not framed to grasp. "They come," the voice panted on, "from—" The voice and the screen went dead. Verco covered his eyes with his hands. Darkness was infinite relief. A minute passed before he felt that he could endure once more even the normal exercise of the optic nerve. He opened his eyes sharply at a little scream from Lavra. He opened them to see how still Kurth Laborie sat. The human heart, too, is framed to endure only so much. And, as the scientist had said, he was old. It was 3 days after Kurth Laborie's death before Verco had brought his prose and verse record up to date. Nothing more had appeared on the video, even after the most patient hours of knob twirling. Now Verco leaned back from the keyboard and contemplated his completed record, and then sat forward with abrupt shock at the thought of the word completed. There was nothing more to write. The situation was not novel in literature. He had read many treatments, and even written a rather successful satire on the theme himself. But here was the truth itself. He was that most imagination-stirring of all figures, the last man on earth, and he found it a boring situation. Kurth Laborie, had he lived, would have devoted his energies in the laboratory to an effort, even conceivably a successful one, to destroy the invaders. Verco knew his own limitations too well to attempt that. Vrist, his gay wild twin, who had been in Lunn on yet another of his fantastic ventures when the Agnaton struck, Vrist would have dreamed up some gallant feat of physical prowess to make the invaders pay dearly for his life. Verco found it difficult to cast himself in so swashbuckling a role. He had never envied Vrist till now. Be jealous of the dead, only the living are alone. Verco smiled as he recalled the line from one of his early poems. It had been only the expression of a pose when he wrote it, a mood for a song that Trussel would sing well. It was in this mood that he found, the ancient word had no modern counterpart, the pulps. He knew their history, how some eccentric of 2,000 years ago, the name was variously rendered as trees or tiller, had buried them in a hermetic capsule to check against the future, how Tarabal had dug them up some 50 years ago, how Kurth Laborie had spent almost the entire Hartle Prize for them because, as he used to assert, their incredible mixture of exact prophecy and arrant nonsense offered the perfect proof of the greatness and helplessness of human ingenuity. But Verco had never read them before. They would at least be a novelty to deaden the boredom of his classically dramatic situation. He passed a more than pleasant hour with Galaxy and Surprising, and the rest, needing the dictionary but rarely. He was particularly impressed by one story detailing, with the most precise minutiae, the politics of the American religious wars, a subject on which he himself had based a not unsuccessful novel. By one Norbert Holt, he observed. Extraordinary how exact a forecast, and yet extraordinary too how many of the stories dealt with space and time travel, which the race had never yet attained, and now never would. And inevitably there was a story, a neat and witty one by an author named Knight, about the last man on earth. He read it and smiled, first at the story, and then at his own stupidity. He found Lavra in the laboratory, of all unexpected places. She was staring fixedly at one corner, where the light did not strike clearly. "What's so fascinating?" Verco asked. Lavra turned suddenly. Her hair and her flesh rippled with a perfect grace of the movement. "I was thinking." Verco's half-formed intent toward her permitted no comment on that improbable statement. "The day before Father died, I was in here with him, and I asked if there was any hope of our escaping ever. Only this time he answered me. He said, yes, there was a way out, but he was afraid of it. It was an idea he'd worked on but never tried, and we'd be wiser not to try it, he said." "I don't believe in arguing with your father, even post-mortem." "But I can't help wondering. And when he said it, he looked over at that corner." Verco went to that corner and drew back a curtain. There was a chair of metal rods and a crude control panel, though it was hard to see what it was intended to control. He dropped the curtain. For a moment he stood watching Lavra. She was a fool, but she was exceedingly lovely, and the child of Kirth-Laborie could hardly carry only a fool's genes. Several generations could grow up in this retreat before the inevitable failure of the most permanent mechanical installations made it uninhabitable. By that time, Earth would be free of agnaton and yellow bands, or they would be so firmly established that there was no hope. The third generation would go forth into the world to perish or— He walked over to Lavra and laid a gentle hand on her golden hair. Verco never understood whether Lavra had been bored before that time. A life of undemanding inaction with plenty of food may well have sufficed her. Certainly she was not bored now. At first she was merely passive. Verco had always suspected that she had meant the gambit to be declined. Then, as her interest mounted, and Verco began to compliment himself on his ability as an instructor, they became certain of their success, and from that point on she was rapt with the fascination of the changes in herself. But even this new development did not totally rid Verco of his own ennui. If there were only something he could do, some positive, Vristian, Kirth-Laberian step that he could take. He damned himself for having been an incompetent aesthetic fool who had taken so for granted the scientific wonders of his age that he had never learned what made them tick, or how greater wonders might be attained. He slept too much, he ate too much, for a brief period he drank too much, until he found boredom even less attractive with a hangover. He tried to write, but the terrible uncertainty of any future audience disheartened him. Sometimes a week would pass without his consciously thinking of agnaton or the yellow bands. Then he would spend a day flogging himself into a state of nervous tension worthy of his uniquely dramatic situation, but he would always relapse. There just wasn't anything to do. Now even the consolation of Lavra's beauty was vanishing, and she began demanding odd items of food which the hydroponic garden could not supply. "If you loved me, you'd find a way to make cheese," or "grow a new kind of peach, a little like a grape, only different." It was while he was listening to a film wire of Terce's, the last she ever made, in the curious tonalities of that newly rediscovered Mozart opera, and seeing her homely face, made even less lovely by the effort of those effortless-sounding notes, that he became conscious of the operative phrase, "If you loved me." "Have I ever said I did?" he snapped. He saw a new and not readily understood expression mar the beauty of Lavra's face. "No," she said in sudden surprise. "No," and her voice fell to flatness. "You haven't." And as her sobs, the first he had ever heard from her, travelled away toward the hydroponic room, he felt a new and not readily understood emotion. He switched off the film wire midway through the pyrotechnic rage of the 18th century Queen of Darkness. Verco found a curious refuge in the pulps. There was a perverse satisfaction in reading the thrilling exploits of other last men on earth. He could feel through them the emotions that he should be feeling directly, and the other stories were fun too, in varying ways. For instance, that astonishingly accurate account of the delicate manoeuvring which averted what threatened to be the first and final atomic war. He noticed one oddity. Every absolutely correct story of the future bore the same byline. Occasionally other writers made good guesses, predicted logical trends, foresaw inevitable extrapolations, but only Norbert Holt named names and dated dates with perfect historical accuracy. It wasn't possible. It was too precise to be plausible. It was far more spectacular than the erratic Nostradamus often discussed in the pulps. But there it was. He had read the Holt stories solidly through in order 6 times without finding a single flaw, when he discovered the copy of Surprising Stories that had slipped behind a shelf and was therefore new to him. He looked at once at the contents page. Yes, there was a Holt, and he felt a twinge of irrational but poignant sadness, one labelled as posthumous. This story, we regret to tell you, is incomplete, and not only because of Norbert Holt's tragic death last month. This is the last in chronological order of Holt's stories of a consistently plotted future, but this fragment was written before his masterpiece, The Siege of Lunn. Holt himself used to tell me that he could never finish it, that he could not find an ending, and he died still not knowing how the last Boredom came out. But here, even though in fragment form, is the last published work of the greatest writer about the future, Norbert Holt. The note was signed with the initials M.S. Verco had long sensed a more than professional intimacy between Holt and his editor, Manning Stern. This obituary introduction must have been a bitter task. But his eyes were hurrying on, almost fearfully, to the first words of The Lost Boredom. There were 3 of them in the retreat, 3 out of all mankind safe from the deadly yellow bands. The great Kurth Laborie himself had constructed. Verco blinked and started again. It still read the same. He took firm hold of the magazine, as though the miracle might slip between his fingers, and dashed off with more energy than he had felt in months. He found Lavra in the hydroponic room. "I have just found," he shouted, "the damnedest unbelievable—" "Darling," said Lavra, "I want some meat." "Don't be silly. We haven't any meat. Nobody's eaten meat except at ritual dinners for generations." "Then I want a ritual dinner." "You can go on wanting, but look at this. Just read those first lines." "Verco," she pleaded, "I want it." "Don't be an idiot." Her lips pouted and her eyes moistened. "Verco, dear, what you said when you were listening to that funny music. Don't you love me?" "No," he barked. Her eyes overflowed. "You don't love me? Not after—" All Verco's pent-up boredom and irritation erupted. "You're beautiful, Lavra, or you were a few months ago, but you're an idiot. I'm not in the habit of loving idiots." "But you—" "I try to assure the perpetuation of the race, questionable though the desirability of such a project seems at the moment. It was not an unpleasant task, but I'm damned if it gives you the right in perpetuity to pester me." She moaned a little as he slammed out of the room. He felt oddly better. Adrenaline is a fine thing for the system. He settled into a chair and resolutely read, his eyes bugging like a cover monster's with amazed disbelief. When he reached the verbatim account of the quarrel he had just enjoyed, he dropped the magazine. It sounded so petty in print, such stupid, inane bickering in the face of— He left the magazine lying there and went back to the hydroponic room. Lavra was crying, noiselessly this time, which somehow made it worse. One hand had automatically plucked a ripe grape, but she was not eating it. He went up behind her and slipped his hand under her long hair and began stroking the nape of her neck. The soundless sobs diminished gradually. When his fingers moved tenderly behind her ears, she turned to him with parted lips. The grape fell from her hand. "I'm sorry," he heard himself saying. "It's me that's the idiot, which, I repeat, I am not in the habit of loving, and you're the mother of my twins, and I do love you." And he realized that the statement was quite possibly, if absurdly, true. "I don't want anything now," Lavra said when words were again in order. She stretched contentedly, and she was still beautiful even in the ungainly distortion which might preserve a race. "Now what were you trying to tell me?" He explained. "And this Holt is always right," he ended. "And now he's writing about us." Oh, then we'll know." "We'll know everything. We'll know what the yellow bands are, and what becomes of them, and what happens to mankind, and—" "And we'll know," said Lavra, "whether it's a boy or a girl." Verko smiled. "Twins. I told you, it runs in my family, no less than one pair to a generation. And I think that's it. Holt's already planted the fact of my having a twin named Vrist, even though he doesn't come into the action." "Twins. That would be nice. They wouldn't be lonely until we could. But get it quick, dear. Read it to me. I can't wait." So he read Norbert Holt's story to her, too excited and too oddly affectionate to point out that her long-standing aversion for print persisted even when she herself was a character. He read on past the quarrel. He read a printable version of the past hour. He read about himself reading the story to her. "Now," she cried, "we're up to now. What happens next?" Verko read. The emotional release of anger and love had set Verko almost at peace with himself again, but a small restlessness still nibbled at his brain. Irrelevantly, he remembered Kurth Labory's cryptic hint of escape. Escape for the two of them, happy now, for the two of them and their— It had to be, according to the odds, their twins. He sauntered curiously into the laboratory, Lavra following him. He drew back the curtain and stared at the chair of metal rods. It was hard to see the control board that seemed to control nothing. He sat in the chair for a better look. He made puzzled grunting noises. Lavra, her curiosity finally stirred by something inedible, reached over his shoulder and poked at the green button. "I don't like that last thing he says about me," Lavra objected. "I don't like anything he says about me. I think your Mr. Holt is a very nasty person." "He says you're beautiful." "And he says you love me. Or does he? It's all mixed up." "It is all mixed up, and I do love you." The kiss was a short one. Lavra had to say, "And what next?" "That's all. It ends there." "Well, aren't you?" Verko felt strange. Holt had described his feelings so precisely. He was at peace and still curious, and the thought of Kurth Labory's escape method did nibble restlessly at his brain. He rose and sauntered into the laboratory, Lavra following him. He drew back the curtain and stared at the chair of metal rods. It was hard to see the control board that seemed to control nothing. He sat in the chair for a better look. He made puzzled grunting noises. Lavra, her curiosity finally stirred by something inedible, reached over his shoulder and poked at the green button. Verko had no time for amazement when Lavra and the laboratory vanished. He saw the archaic vehicle bearing down directly upon him and tried to get out of the way as rapidly as possible. But the chair hampered him, and before he could get to his feet, the vehicle struck. There was a red explosion of pain, and then a long blackness. He later recalled a moment of consciousness at the hospital, and a shrill female voice repeating over and over, "But he wasn't there, and then all of a sudden he was, and I hit him. It was like he came out of nowhere. He wasn't there, and all of a sudden—" Then the blackness came back. All the time of his unconsciousness, all through the semi-conscious nightmares while doctors probed at him and his fever soared, His unconscious mind must have been working on the problem. He knew the complete answer the instant that he saw the paper on his breakfast tray, the first day he was capable of truly seeing anything. The paper was easy to read for a paleolinguist with special training in pulps, easier than the curious concept of breakfast was to assimilate. What mattered was the date, 1948, and the headlines refreshed his knowledge of the Cold War and the impending election. There was something he should remember about that election. He saw it clearly. Kurth Labourie's genius had at last evolved a time machine. That was the one escape, the escape which the scientists had not yet tested and rather distrusted. And Lavra had poked the green button because Norbert Holt had said she had poked, would poke, the green button. How many buttons could a woodpoke poke if a woodpoke would poke? The breakfast didn't seem to agree with him, Doctor. Maybe it was the paper. Makes me run a temperature every morning too. Oh, Doctor, you do say the funniest things. Nothing funnier than this case. Total amnesia, as best as we can judge by his lucid moments, and his clothes won't help us. Must have been on his way to a fancy dress party. Or maybe I should say, fancy undress. Oh, Doctor! Don't tell me nurses can blush. Never did when I was an intern. And you can't say they didn't get a chance, but this character here, not a blessed bit of identification on him. Riding some kind of new-fangled bike that got smashed up. Better hold off on the solid food for a bit. Stick to intravenous feeding. He'd had this trouble before at ritual dinners, Verco finally recalled. Meat was apt to affect him badly. The trouble was that he had not at first recognized those odd strips of oily solid which accompanied the egg as meat. The adjustment was gradual and successful. In this, as in other matters, at the end of 2 weeks he was eating meat easily, and, he confessed, with a faintly obscene, non-ritual pleasure, and equally easily chatting with nurses and fellow patients about the events, which he still privately tended to regard as mummified museum pieces of 1948. His adjustment, in fact, was soon so successful that it could not continue. The doctor made that clear. Got to think about the future, you know. Can't keep you here forever. Nasty, unreasonable prejudice against keeping well men in hospitals. Verco allowed the expected laugh to come forth. But since, he said, gladly accepting the explanation that was so much more credible than the truth, I haven't any idea who I am, where I live, or what my profession is. Can't remember anything? Don't know if you can take shorthand, for instance, or play the bull fiddle. Not a thing. Verco felt it hardly worth while to point out his one manual accomplishment, the operation of the as yet uninvented electronic typewriter. Behold, he thought, the man of the future. I've read all the time travel stories. I know what should happen. I teach them everything Kurth Laborie knew, and I am the greatest man in the world. Only the fictional time travel never happens to a poor dope who took for granted all the science around him, who pushed a button or turned a knob and never gave a damn about what happened or why. Here they're just beginning to get two-dimensional black-and-white short-range television. We'll have, stereoscopic full-color worldwide video, which I'm about as capable of constructing here as my friend the doctor would be of installing electric light in ancient Rome. The mouse of the future. The doctor had been thinking too. He said, Notice you're a great reader. Librarian's been telling me about you. Went through the whole damn hospital library like a bookworm with a tapeworm. Verco laughed dutifully. I like to read, he admitted. Ever try writing? The doctor asked abruptly. almost in the tone in which he might reluctantly advise a girl that her logical future lay in Port Said. This time Verko really laughed. "That does seem to ring a bell, you know. It might be worth trying. But at that, what do I live on until I get started? Hospital trustees here administer a rehabilitation fund. Might wangle a loan. Won't be much, of course, but I always say a single man's got only one mouth to feed, and if he feeds more, he won't be single long." "A little," said Verko with a glance at the newspaper headlines. "Might go a long way." It did. There was the loan itself, which gave him a bank account on which, in turn, he could acquire other short-term loans at exorbitant interest. And there was the election. He had finally reconstructed what he should know about it. There had been a brilliant Wheel of If story in one of the much later pulps on if the Republicans had won the 1948 election, which meant that actually they had lost. And here, in October of 1948, all newspapers, all commentators, and most important, all gamblers, were convinced that they must infallibly win. On Wednesday, November 3rd, Verko repaid his debts and settled down to his writing career, comfortably guaranteed against immediate starvation. A half-dozen attempts at standard fiction failed wretchedly. A matter of tone, editors remarked vaguely, on the rare occasions when they did not confine themselves to the even vaguer phrases of printed rejection forms. A little poetry sold, if you can call that selling, Verko thought bitterly, comparing the financial position of the poet here and in his own world. His failures were beginning to bring back the bitterness and boredom, and his thoughts turned more and more to that future to which he could never know the answer. Twins. It had to be twins. Of opposite sexes, of course. The only hope of the continuance of the race lay in a matter of odds and genetics. Odds. He began to think of the election bet, to figure other angles with which he could turn foreknowledge to profit. But his pulp reading had filled his mind with fears of the paradoxes involved. He had calculated the election bets carefully. They could not affect the outcome of the election. They could not even, in their proportionately small size, affect the odds. But any further step... Verko was, like most conceited men, fond of self-contempt, which he felt he could occasionally afford to indulge in. Possibly his strongest access of self-contempt came when he realized the simplicity of the solution to all his problems. He could write for the science fiction pulps. The one thing that he could handle convincingly and skillfully, with the proper tone, was the future. Possibly start off with a story on the religious wars. He'd done all that research on his novel. Then... It was not until he was about to mail the manuscript that the full pattern of the truth struck him. Soberly, yet half grinning, he crossed out Kurth Verko on the first page and wrote Norbert Holt. Manning Stern rejoiced loudly in this fresh discovery. "This boy's got it. He makes it sound so real that—" The business office was instructed to pay the highest bonus rate, unheard of for a first story, and an intensely cordial letter went to the author outlining immediate needs and offering certain story suggestions. The editor of Surprising was no little surprised at the answer. "I regret to say that all my stories will be based on one consistent scheme of future events, and that you must allow me to stick to my own choice of material." "And who the hell," Manning Stern demanded, "is editing this magazine?" and dictated a somewhat peremptory suggestion for a personal interview. The features were small and sharp, and the face had a sort of dark aliveness. It was a different beauty from Lavra's, and an infinitely different beauty from the curious standards set by the 1949 films. But it was beauty, and it spoke to Norbert Holt. "You'll forgive a certain surprise, Miss Stern," he ventured. "I've read surprising for so many years and never thought—" Manning Stern grinned. "That the editor was also surprising? I'm used to it. Your reaction, I mean. I don't think I'll ever be quite used to being a woman, or a human being for that matter." "Isn't it rather unusual, from what I know of the field?" "Please God, when I find a man who can write, don't let him go all male chauvinist on me. I'm a good editor," said she with becoming modesty, "and don't you ever forget it. And I'm a good scientist. I even worked on the Manhattan Project until some character discovered that my adopted daughter was a Spanish war orphan. But what we're here to talk about is this consistent scheme gimmick of yours. It's all right, of course. It's been done before. But where I frankly think you're crazy is in planning to do it exclusively." Norbert Holt opened his briefcase. "I've brought along an outline that might help convince you." An hour later, Manning Stern glanced at her watch and announced, "End of office hours. Care to continue this slugfest over a martini or 5? I warn you, the more I'm plied, the less pliant I get." And an hour after that, she stated, "We might get someplace if we stay someplace. I mean, the subject seems to be getting elusive." "The hell," Norbert Holt announced recklessly, "with editorial relations. Let's get back to the current state of the opera." "It was paintings. I was telling you about the show at the—" "No, I remember now. It was movies. You were trying to explain the Marx Brothers, unsuccessfully, I may add." "Unsuccessfully," said Manning Stern ruminatively. 5 martinis, and the man can say unsuccessfully successfully. But I try to explain the Marx Brothers yet. Look, Holt, I've got a subversive orphan at home, and she's undoubtedly starving. I've got to feed her. You come home and meet her and have potluck, huh?" "Good, fine. Always like to try a new dish." Manning Stern looked at him curiously. "Now, was that a gag or not? You're funny, Holt. You know a lot about everything, and then all of a sudden you go all man from Mars on the simplest thing. Or do you? Anyway, let's go feed Raquel." And 5 hours later, Holt was saying, "I never thought I'd have this reason for being glad I sold a story. Manning, I haven't had so much fun talking to—" I almost said, "to a woman. I haven't had so much fun talking since—" He had almost said, "since the Agnaton came." She seemed not to notice his abrupt halt. She simply said, "Bless you, Nob. Maybe you aren't a male chauvinist. Maybe even you're— Look, go find a subway or a cab or something. If you stay here another minute, I'm either going to kiss you or admit you're right about your stories, and I don't know which is worse editor-author relations." Manning Stern committed the second breach of relations first. The fan mail on Norbert Holtz's debut left her no doubt that Surprising would profit by anything he chose to write about. She'd never seen such a phenomenally rapid rise in author popularity. Or rather, you could hardly say rise. Holt hit the top with his first story and stayed there. He socked the fans, guest of honor at the Wash-invention, the prose, first president of Science Fiction Writers of America, and the general reader, author of the first pulp-bred science fiction book to stay 3 months on the bestseller list. And never had there been an author who was more pure damned fun to work with. Not that you edited him. You checked his copy for typos and sent it to the printers. Typos were frequent at first. He said something odd about absurd illogical keyboard arrangement. But just being with him, talking about this, that, and those— Raquel, just turning 16, was quite obviously in love with him, praying that he'd have the decency to stay single till she grew up, and, "You know, Manningsita, I am Spanish, and the Mediterranean girls." But there was this occasional feeling of oddness, like the potluck and the illogical keyboard, and that night at SCWA. "I've got a story problem," Norbert Holt announced there. "An idea, and I can't lick it. Maybe if I toss it out to the literary lions." "Story problem?" Manning said, a little more sharply than she'd intended. "I thought everything was outlined for the next 10 years. "This is different. This is a sort of paradox story, and I can't get out of it. It won't end. Something like this. Suppose a man in the remote year X reads a story that tells him how to work a time machine. So he works the time machine and goes back to the year X minus 2000. Let's say, for instance, our time. So in now, he writes the story that is going to read 2000 years later, telling himself how to work the time machine because he knows how to work it, because he read the story which he wrote, because—" Manning was starting to say, "Hold it," when Matt Duncan interrupted with, "Good old endless cycle gimmick. Lot of fun to kick around, but Bob Heinlein did it once and for all by his bootstraps. Damnedest tour de force I ever read. There just aren't any switcheroos left." "Ouroboros," Joe Henderson contributed. Norbert Holt looked a vain question at him. They knew that 1 word per evening was Joe's maximum contribution. Austin Carter picked it up. "Ouroboros, the worm that circles the universe with its tail in its mouth. The Asgard serpent, too. And I think there's something in Mayan literature. All symbols of infinity. No beginning, no ending. Always out by the same door where you went in. See that magnificent novel of Edison's, The Worm Ouroboros, the perfect cyclic novel, ending with its recommencement, stopping not because they're a stopping place, but because it's uneconomical to print the whole text over infinitely." "The Quaker Oats box," said Duncan, "with a Quaker holding a box with a Quaker holding a box with a Quaker holding a—" It was standard professional shop talk. It was a fine evening with the boys. But there was a look of infinitely remote sadness in Norbert Holtz's eyes. That was the evening that Manning violated her first rule of editor-author relationships. They were having martinis in the same bar in which Norbert had, so many years ago, successfully said unsuccessfully. "They've been good years," he remarked, apparently to the olive. There was something wrong with this evening. No bounce, no yumph. "That's a funny tense," Manning confided to her own olive. "Aren't they still good years?" "I've owed you a serious talk for a long time." "You don't have to pay the debt. We don't go in much for being serious, do we? Not so dead earnest catch in the throat serious." "Don't we?" "I've got an awful feeling," Manning admitted, "that you're building up to a proposal, either to me or that olive, and if it's me, I've got an awful feeling I'm going to accept, and Raquel will never forgive me." "You're safe," Norbert said dryly. "That's the serious talk. I want to marry you, darling, and I'm not going to." "I suppose this is the time you twirl your black moustache and tell me you have a wife and family elsewhere." "I hope to God I have." "No, it wasn't very funny, was it?" Manning felt very little, aside from wishing she were dead. "I can't tell you the truth," he went on. "You wouldn't believe it. I've loved 2 women before. One had talent and a brain. The other had beauty and no brain. I think I loved her. The damnedest curse of Ouroboros is that I'll never quite know. If I could take that tail out of that mouth—" "Go on," she encouraged a little wildly. "Talk plot gimmicks. It's easier on me." "And she is carrying, will carry, my child, my children it must be, my twins."
Look, Holt, we came in here, editor and author. Remember back when? Let's go out that way. Don't go on talking. I'm a big girl, but I can't take everything. It's been fun knowing you, and all future manuscripts will be gratefully received. I knew I couldn't say it. I shouldn't have tried, but there won't be any future manuscripts. I've written every Holt I've ever read. Does that make sense? Manning aimed the remark at the olive, but it was gone. So was the martini. Here's the last. He took it out of his breast pocket, neatly folded. The one we talked about at SCWA, the one I couldn't end. Maybe you'll understand. I wanted somehow to make it clear before. The tone of his voice projected a sense of doom, and Manning forgot everything else. Is something going to happen to you? Are you going to... Oh, my dear, no! All right, so you have a wife on every space station in the asteroid belt, but if anything happens to you... I don't know, said Norbert Holt. I can't remember the exact date of that issue. He rose abruptly. I shouldn't have tried a goodbye. See you again, darling, the next time round Ouroboros. She was still staring at the empty martini glass when she heard the shrill of brakes and the excited upspringing of a crowd outside. She read the posthumous fragment late that night, after her eyes had dried sufficiently to make the operation practicable, and through her sorrow her mind fought to help her, making her think, making her be an editor. She understood a little, and disbelieved what she understood, and underneath she prodded herself. But it isn't a story. It's too short, too inconclusive. It'll just disappoint the Holt fans, and that's everybody. Much better if I do a straight obit, take up a full page on it. She fought hard to keep on thinking, not feeling. She had never before experienced so strongly the I have been here before sensation. She had been faced with this dilemma once before, once on some other time spiral, as the boys in SCWA would say, and her decision had been, "It's sentimentality," she protested. "It isn't editing. This decision's right. I know it. And if I go and get another of these attacks and start to change my mind..." She laid the posthumous Holt fragment on the coals. It caught fire quickly. The next morning Raquel greeted her with, "Manning-Sita, who's Norbert Holt?" Manning had slept so restfully that she was even tolerant of foolish questions at breakfast. "Who?" she asked. "Norbert Holt. Somehow the name popped into my mind. Is he perhaps one of your writers?" "Never heard of him." Raquel frowned. "I was almost sure. Can you really remember them all? I'm going to check those bound volumes of Surprising." "Any luck with your... what was it? Holt?" Manning asked the girl a little later. "No, Manning-Sita. I was quite unsuccessful." "Unsuccessful? Now why, in heaven's name," mused Manning Stern, "should I be thinking of martinis at breakfast time?"
The end. Do you want to know how you can help save more of the forgotten stories of futures past? Visit storiesoffuturespast.substack.com/about. Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring time warps. Just kidding. Have a nice day.